Hello and a very warm welcome viewers here watching this special presentation of Sansad TV, Samvaad with your host Kriti Mishra. As the youngest chief economic advisor to the government from 2018 to 2021, he suggested measures that let India emerge from once-in-a-century COVID crisis with strong macroeconomic fundamentals. Today he speaks to us as the Executive Director, India at the International Monetary Fund. Mr. K V Subramanian, welcome to Sansad TV and thank you so much for joining us in our studios.
My pleasure, Kriti.
Sir, let's begin talking about India's G20 presidency. It is considered as one of the most ambitious, historic, 112 outcomes.
Yeah.
Do you think our presidency truly dismantled the barriers, bridged the divides, and sowed the seeds of global collaboration, given the fact the Prime Minister has said that this is the era of global cooperation and trust and not global trust deficit?
Absolutely, Kriti. To me, the ambition behind India's G20 presidency was India's scale. But the delivery of that ambition itself was also phenomenal. So, several outcomes. Of course, if you just look at numerically, the 130, is something that comes to mind. But in terms of the most important, the ones that will generate value, if you look at the fact that India was able to get a consensus Delhi declaration at a time when consensus has been so elusive is, I think, very important. And India was able to do that by going back to the basics. If you would recall, the G20 was set up after the global financial crisis as primarily an economic forum in order to actually resolve the issues that confronts the global economy. By going back to those basics and thereby underemphasizing, if you will, the political or geopolitical aspects, I think India was able to get that consensus. And I think in an environment like now, I think that's a huge diplomatic victory, which really showed up India as, and the Honorable Prime Minister also, the kind of respect that he commands, because eventually, in diplomacy, this matters as well. So that's my first big takeaway. Secondly, and I think from the economic perspective, the infrastructure corridor, I've called that the new Silk Route. If you would remember, and we've learned this in our history text, from the 2nd century to the 15th century, AD, India was one of the most important trade partners, and as you would recall, we've shown it in the 2019-20 economic survey, that was a big contributor to India, accounting for at least 1/3 of world's GDP up until 1750, of which the Silk Route was a big contributor. So the new Silk Route, actually starting from India, running through the Middle East and into the advanced nations, Europe and the US, is something that is very important. If you would recall again, even when writing on trade, we're actually suggested that trade with these advanced economies, Europe and US, is going to be very important. So in some sense, actually, this is, implementation of that particular idea, and therefore the value will be significant. Apart from that, I think, the G20 has really placed India as the digital leader in the world, both on, in terms of financial inclusion, but also on public digital, infrastructure. And I think that is something which is, we've demonstrated, the impact that we've had. Now, 500 million, bank accounts, that's actually almost 1.5 times the population of the United States, and that many bank accounts for the poor. So that's demonstration, and I'll sort of give you a personal anecdote. Now, I've been living in the US for the last about 8 to 10 months. Earlier, from 2001 to 2010, I was there for 10 years. When I would be there, I would oftentimes compare and contrast and say, this thing good that we see in the US, why can't we replicate it in India? That thought used to. Now I actually go there and say, oh, look, there's so many things that India is doing well, which I don't see in the United States, which is a very different perspective. And actually, as an Indian, it really gladdens my heart. But I think, at the heart of that is financial inclusion itself. The fact that I can go and, drink a piece of coconut water and just use my phone and pay, 40 or 50 bucks, or even a cup of coffee. That's the leader in financial inclusion and digital public infrastructure. I think, having been in North Block when we used this infrastructure during COVID to really enable help to the vulnerable, I think that has also really placed India absolutely without dispute as the digital leader. together with that, I think if you take into account what we've done on the climate change or on sort of green energy and renewables, etc., the biofuel alliance. When you put all of them together, I think it's been phenomenal, and clearly is heralded, in some sense, India's stature, not only rising, but also actually, as an established superpower in the Committee of Nations. And that, I think, us as Indians, we can genuinely be proud of that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I second you completely on that one. But since you're talking about India's stature, another very important aspect comes to my mind, the inclusion of African Union in the G20 bloc.
Yes.
Now, the idea was floated in June this year when Prime Minister Modi wrote to the G20 leaders, and finally, we saw this happening in the summit. How do you see the relationship between India and African Union from here on? That is one. And secondly, it also establishes India's position as global leader, not only in terms of inclusion, diplomacy, but also global economic governance and financial governance.
Yeah. No, in fact, I would, interpret this as India really demonstrating that it is the voice of those that generally have not had as much of a significant voice. I mentioned about the financial inclusion, the digital public infrastructure, which enables economic outcomes to reach the vulnerable at the micro level, at the level of a country. But across countries, the African Union, while the G20 had been talking about the role of Africa, that Africa needs to, be given its place, etc. There was talk, but for the first time, there was actually walk when India, led the initiative to have them be included as a 21st member, So I think, India has converted what was mere talk before into walk, and thereby clearly emerging as a leader of the vulnerable, of those that do not have as much of a voice, but also of the global south, at the cross-country level. And I think it also is very important that that India, is able to sort of pass on some of the lessons on governance that India has learned over the last decade or so on to many of the developing economies in Africa. So I think from the perspective of mutual gains, for both India and for the African Union, and India as emerging as sort of the voice of the global south, in particular, but also as a voice of those that have not been heard of as much, I think is a very, very important step. And the 21st member African Union actually is a big, contributor to that.
Absolutely. My next question would be of keen interest to you, the multilateral development banks.
Yeah.
Now, there was consensus on restructuring these institutions. The fact that they do not reflect the current realities of the global scenario right now.
Yeah.
What are the challenges? What are the limitations? And how do we actually infuse transparency in their working?
This is a very good question. Our Honorable Prime Minister has been on record saying that the multilateral institutions, including the UN, for instance, and others that have stemmed from that, need to reflect the reality of the globe today. When you take the idea that India introduced at the start of its presidency, the idea of life, which is lifestyle for environment, that is effectively being actioned when you take the new vision that the World Bank has. World Bank's vision earlier was a society that is free of poverty. Now they've modified it to a society that is free of poverty, but in a livable planet. And I think that in a livable planet is essentially capturing sustainability. It's also capturing how we respond to crises, health crises or, pandemics like the one that we had, a couple of years back. So I think it's a very important dimension, especially in the context of climate change. In other words, now, so one key aspect of this change is reflecting objectives that are very important for the world going forward, and sustainable development, climate change are an important part of. At the same time, it is also important for these multilateral institutions to also be, in some sense representative of, the new world order. We just spoke about how India, for instance, now commands a status, in this world order. I think some of these institutions need to start reflecting those, and I think reform of these institutions along those directions will be very important. In other words, not only in enabling, the objectives of these institutions to match with the new world order and the problems that are pressing for the world today, but also actual governance level changes in being able to achieve these objectives. I think those are very important steps. If you take, for instance, the International Monetary Fund, they're as part of what are called Article 4 consultations. These are basically macroeconomic assessments of each country. A possible macroeconomic implications and risks that are posed by climate change are becoming part of the assessment itself. So these are all steps that are being taken in being able to capture this idea of the changing world and the new problems that the world is encountering, and these institutions reflecting that reality.
Absolutely. So there's another important aspect about regulating cryptocurrency. Now we know that cryptocurrency has been used in illicit trade, drug trafficking, perhaps terror financing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it is the need of the hour to regulate cryptocurrency?
Absolutely. I think you said it. Cryptocurrency can be used for nefarious activities, which is, for instance, it can be used for terror financing. It could also be, unless you track the way these transactions are actually happening, it can also be used for money laundering and a lot of other activities as well. So it's important to actually track these illicit uses of cryptocurrency, but at the same time also reap some of the benefits from. And I think which better country than India to be able to actually understand that, given the kind of progress that we've had in digital money in the economy. And I think therefore India was sort of enthusiastic in pushing for this, and I think now the agreement that the global world order needs to actually think about regulation of cryptocurrencies, I think is a very important step.
All right, let's talk about your favorite topic, Indian economy. India's G20 presidency came at a time when we are the rising star.
Yeah.
There's global gloom, and India is the shining star.
Yeah.
We're the fastest growing economy when
Yep.
most of the nations are facing recession.
Yep.
How do you see our position in terms of the economic growth vis-a-vis the world growth?
So, Kriti, here I'm going to actually provide two perspectives. First is exactly, the perspective that you've asked for, which is India in the cross-country sort of, setup. How are we comparing? There's absolutely no doubt that, if you look at a 3-year period, and this 3-year period is important because during the pandemic, the lockdowns that had to be done actually meant that growth, sort of GDP declined, across the world, even in India as well. So when you look at a 3-year perspective, you can take into account not just the decline, but the recovery thereafter as well. So when you look at a 3-year perspective, and I wrote in the Times of India looking at the 3-year growth rates for all the top 10 economies, and India has recorded by far the highest growth, among all the top 10 countries. But we've done that with very strong macro fundamentals, of which inflation is actually the very important metric. Generally, macroeconomics economists look at inflation, fiscal deficit, and current account deficit as the three metrics that matter. If you look at inflation, while the rest of the world is encountering anywhere between, and when I talk about advanced economies, between 2.5 to 3.5, 4 times the historical average inflation, we've had inflation that is actually about the historical average, slightly less than that. Not just that, we've actually been able to do the necessary, supply side measures, spend on the economy, infrastructure spending, while keeping the, fiscal deficit actually in a tight leash in some sense, and being able to also, work on demand side measures, which has helped the recovery tremendously. So this perspective, which is in a cross-country context, is important. But I also would like to highlight to our viewers the perspective, if you contrast the last 2 crises, If you take the global financial crisis, which India and the rest of the world weathered around 2008, 2009, and that period, vis-a-vis the crisis that was induced by the COVID pandemic, I think the contrast is very stark. At that time, each of these three metrics that I spoke about, inflation, we had double-digit inflation every month for 18 months consecutively, and that was without a supply side shock that that COVID induced. So just imagine the what if scenario. If we had sort of followed that template that was done at that time, then we might have had very likely 20% inflation for maybe 2 years every month, and India has avoided that scenario actually because of very sagacious policy making. At the same time, fiscal deficit was actually about three and a half times that of peer economies. So we spent far more than was optimal. Current account deficit touching almost 6%, and therefore India became part of the fragile five. In contrast, now India has actually become part of the top 5 economies, which many commentators call it as a famous 5. So fragile 5 versus famous 5, I think that perspective is very important. Even on the health side, and I think this is important to keep in mind, on a per capita basis, and this is something we showed in the economic survey as well, we've done tremendously well for a country of 1.4 billion population, and the pandemic spreads much faster in a larger population, especially in a denser population like the one that we've had in India. We came up with vaccines where actually we were able to, by doing the lockdown at a time when the pandemic was really sort of surging in the first wave, no masks at that time, no testing infrastructure, even doctors themselves are actually learning whether they should be putting patients on ventilator or not, going up the learning curve. India was able to actually delay the peak of the pandemic, which would have been May otherwise, to about around September, thereby saving a lot of lives. And there are now many studies that are coming in. Stanford, for instance, has shown possibly more than 1 lakh lives have been saved. So even on the health side and coming up with our own vaccine, sometimes, and I actually sort of think about the what if scenario. If, for instance, in a different, dispensation, maybe with policy paralysis, we would have had possible mayhem, so I think overall, these have really put us in a very salutary position for us to continue growing at 7% plus, maybe touching 8% going forward. And you would remember I said that actually around 2 years back.
Absolutely. I do remember our interview then. But before I wrap up this conversation, how's your stint going on in IMF?
Enjoying it. It's a very different perspective. My previous role here actually gave me a very, very good understanding, of course, and the opportunity to contribute for my motherland. The IMF role actually gives you a very good perspective of the global economy, but also some of the geopolitical context as well. So I think it's a tremendous learning. And also, as it turns out, the two countries that are in my portfolio, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, had been going through some economic trouble, and being able to help them with an aid package is something that I've sort of had against the privilege and the pleasure of.
Absolutely, and it's our pleasure also to have you in our studio, and of course for that meaningful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Kriti.
Well, viewers, that's all I had for you in this edition. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Sansad TV. Goodbye for now from my side.